All right, good afternoon, ancient history students. This is the lecture for Wednesday, April 29th, and this is the second half of chapter 78, pages 688 to 696. And here we're going to be talking about primarily Julius Caesar, the decimation and the demise of the first triumvirate, his rise to power, and then his rather ignominious and rapid decline with the assassination of Caesar in 44 BC by the Senate. Of course, this has been glorified and popularized by William Shakespeare, and then this many of these phrases, these moments, these uh, episodes in this drama have kind of come down through the ages. You know, the word Caesar, for example, is used as a kind of a metaphor for a king. The German Kaiser, that's a German spelling of Caesar. And so there's this kind of just aura and fascination with this story. And the great thing about it is that it's true. It's stranger than fiction. So this gentleman kind of mesmerized Rome when he lived, and he stands as a cautionary tale, doesn't he, in terms of what happens when um, you try to set up a power sharing arrangement and a representative system. And this is kind of, again, not to be too serious about things, but can our republic last? Are we kind of starting down that path toward a Caesar? I don't think we're there yet, but I do see in the form of decadence and political corruption, uh, debt, immigration. There's some big issues out there that are very similar to what kind of plagued Rome. But remember, if the Roman experience began, somewhere in the 600s, BC, and then you get this shift to the Republic in 509 BC, and then Caesar is killed in 44, and of course he was not operating within the usual strictures of the Republic. When did the Republic end? Was it with Sulla? Was it with Gracchi? I mean, let's say it was 100, but they didn't admit that it was done. But with Julius Caesar, it's very clear. Even though he wasn't an advocate of the traditional Republic, um, the Republic dies with him. And then there's a kind of a sorting out that occurs, and that's in chapter 79, and that'll be the last chapter we read for the class. And you're going to get the first, historically, the first emperor, Caesar Augustus. Augustus Caesar is what sometimes he is referred to. Octavian was his actual given name. But and then, but the empire lasts until 476 A.D. So that's a pretty long run. That's 1,000 years of Rome being kind of on the map and doing its thing, so to speak. That's a long run, but half of it was not as a republic. It was a kind of administrative. I wouldn't even call it a monarchy. It was this kind of strange amalgam, because one of the features that you'll learn next year is that when they adopted the empire and the emperor process, they didn't get rid of councils, they didn't get rid of tribunes, they didn't get rid of the Senate, but they were just meaningless posts. They didn't really have a lot of power. Okay, so anyway, that's what we're going to be talking about today. Okay. All right. So last we left the story, Julius Caesar was hightailing it to Britain. So you have a little map on page 688 in your book, right, where you see the kind of the ends of the earth. This is Albion, and uh, Bauer gives us a little bit of an early history of Britain. It was settled by Celts. We've heard that name before. The Celts were actually Gauls. They came all the way from in between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. They got around, but they actually got on boats and went over to what we call Britain. She says tribes didn't have the space to be nomadic. They settled down into a network of little tribal kingdoms. What we know of them comes from Caesar's own account, and in a distorted form much later, Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of Britannia. But actually, Caesar is he's writing down his experiences, and he's making sure they get back to Rome. You talk about a PR guy. He knew how to do marketing, and part of the reason why he was able to kind of become so popular was that he really attended to his image and how he was being portrayed in what you would call the media of their day. So there's a bit of myth involved with this early history of Great Britain. They talk about a grandson of Aeneas, if you've read the Aeneid, which I know you have. So this is all somewhat of a story, right? It's not really, I wouldn't call it so-called true. But anyway, there is this kind of mythical king of the Britons who appears in Julius Caesar's account as a rogue warrior who usurped the throne of the Travantes tribe. So you have this legend. This is with the King Arthur legend of this the king of the Britons who had kind of emerged and then was squashed by the Anglo-Saxon invaders, and that's for medieval history, and you'll get to that next year. But anyway, getting back to Caesar, these sporadic, scattered tribes, and it's mostly in southern England. He doesn't really get up to what's called Caledonia, which is modern day Scotland, and it certainly doesn't get over to Ireland. One of the great stories in the Roman Empire was the story of Patricio, who is a son of a Roman governor or like large landowner in Britain. So when the Romans became an empire, they really spread out and they established this kind of system of administration all over what would later become Western Europe and Christendom and medieval Europe. Patricio was kidnapped by Irish raiders and brought back over to Ireland. Well, you know who Patricio is. His name ends up becoming Patrick, and he becomes Saint Patrick. So that's a long ways away. That's like a good 500 years later from this period of time. So Bauer talks about a King Lud, who is the chieftain in the south of England along the river called the Thames, and that's where eventually there's going to be a settlement established by the Romans called Lundres, Lundres, which you can kind of tell ends up becoming London. All right, Lud dies. There's a power vacuum. There's a prince by the name of Mandubratius, and he hears that Caesar is across the channel in northern Gaul. And of course, Caesar had been a governor of Gaul. And so Mandubratius says, "Hey, can you help me gain my kingdom back?" And as a result, as a bargaining chip, he basically agreed to give the Roman Republic tribute and become part of a province of Rome. And so his Mandubratius's opponent was a man by the name of Cassivellaunus, and you get an idea. There's a description which I can't even imagine. Caesar evaluated his opposition. All the Britons dye their bodies with woad, which produces a blue color, he wrote on his return, and shave the whole of their bodies except the head and the upper lip. So that would have been an interesting vision for you in terms of them fighting. Here's an interesting story. The Romans did not invent the chariot. The English did. And so these were weapons that you had a horse drawing kind of a wagon with people in it. one person would be running, making sure the horse was going in the right direction, and you had other people in it that would be having spears and bows and arrows and things of that nature. So the chariot, whether it's 2 horse, 4 horse, whatever, Caesar says, "Wow, that's actually a pretty interesting type of weapon," and it changed the tactics of the Roman army. And so Caesar sent his cavalry out in front instead and managed to push Cassilvanus back to the Thames, which was protected by sharp stakes driven into the riverbed beneath the surface of the water. Eventually, Caesar basically lays siege to Cassilvanus's headquarters. He ends up backing down, and Caesar ends up being able to claim that he conquered Britain. At that point, he starts heading back to Rome. He doesn't get all the way, but remember his headquarters was in northern Italy near the river called Rubicon. As he's heading back, he gets some very bad news that Pompey's wife, named Julia, dies. This is in 53 BC. Now, if you remember, because of the trying to cement these political deals with the families, Julia is Caesar's daughter, and she dies in childbirth, and Caesar blames Pompey for lack of care for his daughter. And so there's starting to become some significantly more bad blood between Pompey and Caesar. And of course, Pompey is jealous of Caesar's newfound fame, and so that's happening. Now, the last time we talked, where was Crassus? He's the third member of the triumvirate, right? This kind of extra or unconstitutional power arrangement. Well, he was off seeking glory in the east, and he is trying to defeat the rising Parthian Empire, which had risen in the wake of the decline of the Seleucid Empire. Well, Crassus meets disaster along the Euphrates River in 53 BC. This is near where, according to the Bible, where Nabonidus was born and where Terah, the father of Abraham, had died. So Abraham of Ur, this is his kind of old stomping grounds. And at that point, there was a battle between Crassus' forces and the Parthians. It said they were thus hit and killed, Plutarch says, dying not by a quick and easy death, but with miserable pains and convulsions. For writhing upon the darts in their bodies, they broke them in their wounds. And then when they would be forced to pluck out their barbed points, they caught their veins. And it's just a terrible way to go. And so Crassus sent his son to try to conduct a counterattack. Publius is killed, and 2 days later, Crassus is killed with almost all of his men. So Crassus never really gets to lay claim to military glory. He's defeated by the Parthians, his son is dead, and most of his forces are dead. And the triumvirate is now down to a biumvirate, right, between Pompey and Caesar. Okay, and so at that point, really, the extension of Roman power had been stopped at the Euphrates River. So they have Syria, they have Palestine. You're going to see in a second. They also have Egypt, Asia Pontus, which is Asia Minor, Macedonia, Greece, North Africa, which is where Carthage is, Spain, Gaul, Britain. That's a big chunk of the known world. But it stops at the Parthian border. Okay. So word gets back that Crassus is dead. This is in 52 BC. And then Caesar gets to the Rubicon and kind of reassesses his situation. At that time, Pompey decides that he's going to rip up the arrangement. And he ends up going to the Senate and persuading them that Julius Caesar is a threat to the peace and stability of Rome, which of course is ironic because Pompey, he certainly was acting like a dictator himself, but he's getting the sense that Julius Caesar's fame and fortune has eclipsed his, and this is one of the old adages that if you try to be the puppet master, sometimes the puppet is not willing to go along with the master. Pompey and Crassus were senior to Julius Caesar, but it's Caesar that has kind of gotten the upper hand in this little battle. So basically, the Senate sends a message to Caesar that if you cross the Rubicon River, it's a declaration of war, and we're going to try to stop you. And so basically, don't if you do it, you're basically plunging Rome into civil war. And so for a while, Caesar kind of, you know, ponders this. This is in 52 BC, and then in a very famous kind of a Latin phrase, alea, and I'm sure I'm saying this wrong, alea iacta est, which is Latin for "let the die be cast." So if you're playing craps or you're playing kind of a gambling game with dice, let the die be cast. That's what you would say when you threw the dice. And so, in some ways, that's kind of what Caesar is doing. He is gambling with his political future, and he's really gambling with the future of Rome itself. But he has decided that he is going to ignore the Senate warning. He's going to go against his old friend Pompey. Of course, he's still blaming him for the death of his daughter. So this is kind of personal. Cicero makes I think, tragic mistake, and actually tries to join the army that Pompey tries to form in southern Italy. Eventually, Pompey is going to end up fleeing to Greece. More on that in a moment. And so, just like Sulla, Caesar marches into Rome, bursts through the gates, and with Pompey and his army moved south, waiting for maybe a decision, maybe to engage Julius Caesar later, Caesar ends up taking full power in Rome. And this is in 48, 40 or 50 BC, sorry, 50 BC. Now, if you remember, when Sulla did this, he rounded up his political opponents, put them in the Circus Maximus, and killed them all. Caesar does not do this. He's much more of a sly politician, and so he does not round up his political enemies. In fact, he kind of embraces them, the ones that are left, and he ends up distributing a lot of this new wealth that the Roman administration had been gathering, and he started to redistribute it even more to the people. So he's really doing kind of a Gracchi style land and economic reform. And this is why a lot of people loved him, because he was very, very popular. We would call, if it was in the Greek sense, he would be a demagogue. And he's increasingly a threat to the status quo and the people in the Senate. Now, these people are not, they're playing along with the role of the republic, but these politicians are just basically self-interested, and so it's very few people are actually thinking about the long-term interests of the Roman people. I think it's fair to say that Julius Caesar probably is the one that's thinking about them the most, but is he doing it for the right reasons? Is he doing it for the benefit of the people, or is he doing it to kind of gain their favor? Give them bread, give them circuses, give them, free stuff, and then they'll be with you forever. So, eventually, Pompey says, he's too strong to fight in Italy. I'm going to take my army and flee to Greece. And this is in northern Greece, called in the Battle of Pharsalus. I'm going to see if this is Yeah, it's not on the map, but basically it's in north. Oh yeah, here it is. Plains of Pharsalia. So this is on page 684. If you see that right there, 684. All right, so that is a famous battle. You'll need to know that. And so Caesar um, pursues Pompey's army in Greece and defeats them. And now Pompey, how many times has he fled? He fled from Rome, he fled from Italy, and then he flees from the battlefield in Pharsalus. And you know where he heads? He heads to Egypt. He gets on a boat and heads south to Alexandria, where he's hoping that he will be welcomed by the Ptolemy monarchy, uh, who is actually here's one of the great names in history. There's Ptolemy the 13th, and he has a sister by the name of Cleopatra. So Pompey goes to the Egyptians, and say, "Hey, hide me, help me. Maybe you can help me regain power in Rome." But Julius Caesar is hot on his trail, and the Ptolemy monarchy with Cleopatra decides, we're going to actually hold on for 1 second. Come here, buddy. Lay down. They decide that we're not going to hitch our wagon to Pompey. We're going to hitch our wagon to the more popular to the more popular Roman, which is Julius Caesar. So they actually kill Pompey and put his head on a platter and present them to Caesar when he comes. At that time, Caesar decides that he likes what he sees, and he ends up staying in Egypt for a while and conducts a pretty furious love affair with Cleopatra. Of course, this is discussed not so much in Julius Caesar, the play by Shakespeare, but then there's a play that he writes about Antony and Cleopatra, and that Mark Antony was one of Julius Caesar's chief military lieutenants. Caesar and Cleopatra have a child, and so he stays there for a while. And while he's there, through 46 BC, he is elected by acclamation 4 times as consul. So they're still going through the motions here of a republic. But, if he's being elected, when he's not even there, and they're doing it consecutively, they're certainly not following the technical rules of the republic. And so a lot of people start calling him an dictator, or first dictator, or dictator for life. And what is a dictator for life? Is that a king? Is that an emperor? Is this anything that the republic even stands for? You think about Sulla. Sulla considered himself a dictator for life. And you might say that Julius Caesar is kind of a kinder, gentler Sulla, because he is not as bloodthirsty as maybe his predecessor. But he certainly actually has more ambition and more power than what Sulla ever had. And so he eventually decides, hey, I got to get back to Rome, but before I do, I'm going to do a little tour around some of these new holdings that the Roman Republic has. So he goes up to Pontus, he goes back down through Palestine, back through Egypt, goes through Carthage, up through Spain, and back down to Rome. And here's another great Latin phrase during this time. This is on page 693. It says, Veni, vidi, vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. And he actually, when he returns to Rome, and if you remember the Etruscan kings way back at the beginning of the semester when we were making the transition from Greece to Rome. Remember what were some of the symbols of Etruscan kingship? The fasces, the lictors. But then what did this guy wear? What did the kings of Etruscan, what color? A purple robe. And who was allowed to wear a purple robe and be hailed with the ceremonial title of Imperator, Emperor Caesar. So a lot of people are like, oh my gosh, what are we? This is the return of Tarquin. This is the return of the Etruscan kings, and the Senate is actually getting really, really nervous. He has so much, and again, pardon the pun, he has so much gall that he actually changes the calendar of Rome, and this is the calendar that we essentially still have today. It's called the Julian calendar, Julius Caesar, Julian calendar, and so he actually changes. He creates a system of leap years that we follow now, and so he actually extends the length of days for this one year to kind of get on a new schedule. And so in this year, there was 445 days long instead of 356. So in 44 BC, the Senate decides to make Julius Caesar dictator for life. All right, so they basically decided, hey, this is just kind of a crisis management situation. We're really afraid of this guy. We'd like for him to be gone, but we don't know how to stop him. So on February 15th in 44 BC, Mark Antony, at least this is according to the records, this is on the top of page 694, made a trial run at putting a crown on Caesar's head. Antony, as part of a religious festival, was carrying a diadem with a laurel wreath tied to it. It's kind of like a crown. He offered it to Caesar, but the crowd responded with only scattered applause. Caesar, reading their mood, pushed it away several times, which brought on a much bigger cheer. So it's like, oh, I'm being offered this crown, but I'm going to reject it. So that made him even more popular. So maybe he's a king just without a crown. The people of Rome had made it quite clear that they would not like Caesar to become an actual king. Perhaps king had too many echoes of the Parthians to the east. Perhaps the lingering idea that Rome should be a meritocracy made the hereditary nature of a kingship repugnant. Caesar had no legitimate sons, but he had named his 18-year-old nephew, and remember this guy's name, Octavian, son of his sister's daughter, as his legal heir in his will. Pardon me just for one moment. So he doesn't really have an heir. He recognizes that the people of Rome are a little bit skittish about this idea of having a king. But is he acting like a king? You bet he is. And so he's got really all of the power of Rome, total control. He's basically acting as a one-man Senate, tribune, assembly, and council, kind of all rolled into one. And I think, and Shakespeare really, he based a lot of his play on Plutarch's biography of Julius Caesar, and Plutarch makes a pretty big deal about this moment when Mark Antony offered him the crown. And so, whether it was, something that was real or imagined or something like that, the point is, after that episode, there are factions within the Senate that say we have had enough of this guy, and so they start to plot his death, and so they start to plot his assassination, just like they did with both Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. Okay, so there was actually some effort to try to, maybe compromise a little bit, saying, well, maybe you could wear a crown, but only when you were outside of Rome conquering the Parthians, because there was actually a legend, according to Bauer, that said that the only kind of ruler that could defeat the Parthians was a king, but then you'd have to kind of return it once you got back. But people like Brutus and Cassius, Brutus was actually a a cousin of Caesar by law. This was too much for them. So on March 15th, which is considered the Ides of March, um, they decide to make their move. And let me just read you a little bit of this is the biography of Caesar's heir Octavian, the Greek writer Nicholas of Damascus. This is how he describes the event. This is on page 694. When he came in and the Senate saw him, the members rose out of respect for him. Those who intended to lay hands on him were all about him. The first to come to him was Tullius Cimber, whose brother Caesar had exiled, and stepping forward as though to make an urgent appeal on behalf of his brother, seized Caesar's toga, seeming to act rather boldly for a supplication, like, oh please, almost like pretending that he was just begging, oh, can you please release my brother? He prevented him from standing up and using his hands if he so wished. So he's kind of pushing him down. Caesar was very angry, but the men held to their purpose and all suddenly bared their daggers and rushed upon him. So, much like, the Wild West in American history, nobody back then, there was no really kind of official police force. People defended themselves. There were no pistols in the wild back like in the Wild West, but every man had a dagger, which is kind of a mini sword, and they would have it on their belt underneath their toga, and so they flash their daggers and they go towards Caesar. He says first Servilius Casca, and he's actually a character in the Julius Caesar play. He stabs Caesar on the left shoulder, a little above the collarbone, at which he had aimed but missed through nervousness. Caesar sprang up to defend himself against him, and Casca called to his brother, speaking in Greek in his excitement. The latter obeyed him, and I think that there's actually, Shakespeare uses that they didn't understand Greek, many of them, and so it was all Greek to me, and that's a phrase that people use now. The latter obeyed him and drove his sword into Caesar's side. A moment before Cassius, and Cassius is one of the great characters in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. Ah, young Cassius, he has a lean and hungry look, had struck him obliquely across the face. And then Decimus Brutus struck him through the thigh. Not the Brutus, his cousin, but another man named Brutus. Cassius Longinus was eager to give another stroke, like he wants to kill him again, but he missed, and he struck Marcus Brutus on the hand. Licinius too made a lunge at Caesar, but struck Rubrius on the thigh. So it's kind of chaotic. It looked as if they were fighting over Caesar. He fell under many wounds before the statue of Pompey, which is ironic. And there was not one of them but struck him as lay lifeless, to show that each of them had a share in the deed, until he had received 35 wounds and breathed his last. So even though he was dead, people who had not done the deed actually went and stabbed him anyway, so that they could all have said that they were killing Caesar, this dictator, this abhorrent man who was destroying the republic. So, in this sense, the Senate, I think, believed that they were restoring the republic and getting rid of this dictator. And so, a big theme in the play Julius Caesar is, does Brutus have what it takes to go through this? Like, he knows what he has to do. He knows that Caesar is bad for the republic. But up until this point, there's a real question about, had Caesar done anything differently than some of these other people, and they weren't killed. And so, does he have kind of the strength of character to do what he thinks is right? And what he thinks is right is actually killing his friend. And so, is there? I mean, there's all sorts of questions there. Is it legitimate? Is it right for a politician to kill somebody else for the greater good? If you think about it from a Christian perspective, is murder justified in that? Had Caesar so violated the rules and was so threatening to safety and order, and had he really violated not just the technical rules of the republic, but was he such a danger that it required him to be killed? That's a big theme inside Julius Caesar, the play. And so on the bottom of 695, it continues. This is Bauer now. Plutarch says that he died crying out for help. Several Greek accounts, and of course, the Greeks at this time, they were part of the Roman sphere of influence, and they were kind of like the academics of the period. And so a lot of Greek historians, like Plutarch, had these different accounts. And so in Greek accounts, according to these, he says, he called out in Greek to Brutus, "Even you, my son?" So that means A2, Brutus, like you, Brutus, really? You're going to kill me? Suetonius, who is a Roman historian, says that as Caesar was first stabbed, he cried out in blank surprise, "But this is force?" Almost like turning it back on him. Like, you're worried about me doing an unjust act? What are you doing? And so I like to read this too because I think it's pretty. A good summary of where things stand. And again, this is one of the reasons why I like Bauer, because I think she's a really good author. Oh, by the way, there's a little asterisk at the bottom of 695. It says, either way, he did not utter the famous Latin phrase "et tu, Brute," which was invented by Shakespeare 1,500 years later. Well, I like it. So even if he didn't say it, I still think it's pretty cool. So here's Bauer kind of trying to sum up. It says, Caesar's killers were simply at the logical end of a process that had begun with the Gracchi 100 years before. So basically, she's saying that, look, this is just the logical conclusion of a process that started when Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus were killed. No constitution or balance of power had ever been able to restrain the ambition of the powerful. Caesar himself had demonstrated this, and now he had fallen by the same methods he had used. But his shock reveals that the idea of the Republic still had a grasp on the Roman imagination. Like, oh my God, are you really doing this to me? Like, what have I done? Well, you're basically preempting the Republic. But he kind of doesn't understand what he's doing, and he's shocked that this would have caused so much violence. His shock reveals, it says, the official name of the Republic engraved on the standards of the legions and on the buildings of Rome itself was, and you'll need to know this, SPQR, Senitas Populusque Romani, the Senate and the people of Rome. Rome is a place where the people have power. That's the notion of a republic, right? This had not been true for decades, really back to the Gracchi. But the Romans had no other way to think of themselves and no other name for their collective identity. It was a powerful lie, Bauer argues, and even a dictator could still be aghast, somebody like Caesar, when its falsity was forced in front of his eyes. So the suggestion is that even Julius Caesar kind of didn't realize what he was up to. Now, I don't know about that. But what I will say is that nobody thought, even at that time, that what they were up to was creating an empire. All of them were power hungry. They had recognized that the kind of formality of the republic had kind of been eclipsed, but they weren't arguing for an empire. Now, words are cheap and actions count, right? Actions, not words. And so the actions of the Romans are really, I mean, what is it but an empire? I mean, they've got basically Western Europe, Northern Africa, Palestine, and up to the Euphrates River. To me, that sounds like an empire. But they're not really willing to acknowledge that that's what they're doing. Now, are we the same? Where is the American military? It's in Europe. It's in South America. It's in the Far East. It's in uh, Latin America. Did I say that? Yeah, and it's also in parts of Africa. So now, are we taking that over like the way the Romans did? Surely not. We're not exacting tribute and all of that. In fact, a lot of people want us there, and there's agreements and treaties to that effect. Um, but are we lying to ourselves? That's an interesting question, isn't it? Right? Were the Romans lying? Were they not willing to admit that their republic had been gone? Are we willing to admit that maybe our republic is really not really working the way we want it to? People like Cicero, people like the Gracchi, they actually wanted to change it. They wanted to fix it. Are we willing to fix it, or do we have ideas that might make us less of a kind of empire light? Maybe that's the way just to describe it. So anyway, that's the end of chapter 78. It's a very, very momentous period of time. 44 BC, 15 March, Caesar's dead. Now we got one more chapter to do in Bauer, and that's going to get us to 0 AD, the incarnation, the moment in history. Nothing else compares, right? Because it's God. All right, but God's history is colliding with what? Ours. And it's happening kind of in the fullness of time in that little stable in Bethlehem, which by that point was a province of the Roman Empire. And the first emperor who never admitted that he was an emperor, but acted like it, was a guy by the name of Octavian. He is the nephew of Caesar by marriage. So really not a lot of blood connection there. But he had been the heir in Caesar's will, and he's going to act eventually like he is heir to the throne. So even though Caesar would have denied that he was a king, he rejected the crown. But why Octavian? Because he's a member of his family. And so this idea of who takes over. So if we're going to push the republic off to the side, what replaces it? And what I think Rome ends up deciding to do is to have two parallel systems. We're going to keep the old system, the republic, and continue with elections and continue with councils. And it's almost like, okay, you can work your way up. But then there's this other thing called the empire. And what we're going to find is that they give it a shot at trying to do this kind of family succession, almost like having royal families. They try that for a while, but without a lot of success. And eventually they reckon on another idea, which is to basically appoint military strongmen and military leaders that have proven their mettle. And then what ends up happening is that the old leader adopts the new leader. So makes him his son, but in a legal sense and not in a kind of birth sense. So that's kind of how they end up kind of splitting the difference. But Octavian goes to his grave denying, I think it's 14 AD, that he was ever an emperor. But after that, people actually start calling themselves emperor and start functioning like that. But that's for the next chapter. What we'll do next is we are going to read Plutarch. We're going to read Cicero's account, his account of Cicero. This is one of the most favorite of the Roman Republicans of our founding fathers, like Cincinnatus. So we're going to read about Cicero and his efforts to defeat some of the forces that he had to live with, but he eventually ends up kind of buying it at the hands of Octavian. And then we'll read the account of Julius Caesar. So we're going to, so Friday, there's no live class, okay? You read 219 to 228 in Plutarch on Cicero, so that's the first half of it. So just read, that's all I want you to do. And then on Tuesday, the following Tuesday, so that's May 5th, we'll have a live class where you'll finish up reading Cicero. That's 229 to 238. So basically, if you want to, just over the weekend, you could just read the whole thing. But by Tuesday, we're going to have a live class, and we're going to talk about Cicero. And then on Wednesday, no formal class. You will you'll read about Julius Caesar, 704 to 711, and then you will finish up Caesar on Friday, and we'll have a live class discussing Julius Caesar. So that's the plan for the really the next 2 weeks. Okay, all right. Get those assignments finished, please. Get on that, and hopefully you can catch up and start raising your grade. Okay, this stuff counts. Okay, if you need any help, you let me know. Okay, God bless you, and we'll talk to you soon.